1990s, the expansion of renewable energies has been driven forward, and the discussion about the energy transition process has grown. Far from focusing on reducing consumption, we are instead looking for new sources of energy, and that brings not only solutions but also new challenges. In the meantime, in Germany, where I am located, there are large wind farms, especially in the north, and the electricity generated there has to be transported to the consumer, together with the traditional environmentally unfriendly electricity, especially to the south, where the large cities and the strongest economic areas are.
Since some claim that the existing power grid is already reaching the limits of its capacity, the electricity highways projects have been created. So far, Südostlink, Südlink, and Ultranet. This has been accompanied by many protests from citizens. In some cases, they question the necessity of the projects. In others, they only question the designated route, or, what's relevant for us, they advocate a specific technological solution. What do we mean by technological solution? Basically, it's the choice between overhead lines or underground cables. While the already familiar overhead lines require transmission lines that run above the ground from tower to tower, the innovative technology of underground cabling promises an inconspicuous grid development by laying even more cables 1.5 meters under the ground. This alternative was created when the negotiation processes became too complex and time-consuming. The law that makes underground cabling possible was first passed in Lower Saxony in 2007, and then 7 years later in the entire country as a measure to improve acceptance. Obviously, there will be less resistance if the new grid is laid almost invisible. Nothing happened here, alright? So the protest should become less and the progress should be set in motion. But the laying of underground cables in comparison with the construction of overhead lines is very expensive, 6 to 13 times more or less, depending on the conditions of the area. It is also not technically equivalent. Its testing is still in its nappies. It warranties low security of supply. It's not free of harmful effects on nature, and it is a disadvantage for our culture. Well, buried cables are not universal remedy.
But overhead power lines bring the karma of being high altitude structures that affect the landscape. A factor that for many seems to be a significant counterbalance. With such pylon-like intervention, the landscape would be outraged. The motivation of the present reflection is then to analyze this particular criterion, which is taken into account for the decision. Why do transmission lines represent visible objects in the landscape that are generally perceived as disturbing? Okay, we have the question, now we have to think. Let's start with the discourses of the participants. A Germany-wide survey shows that the attitude towards underground cables is clearly more positive than towards overhead lines. But the motives leading to this result are very heterogeneous. Some citizens have concern about nature conservation, some about their health, some about the value of their property, some about the obstacles that the expansion of the grid will have on farming, and some about the preservation of old traditions, etc., etc.
Regardless of how many different causes they may have, the citizens are divided into pro and contra groups. These groups can be seen as articulated fronts, and each front has one discourse. But now it seems that all the people who want underground cables find the view of the mast annoying. A certain interpretation of the landscape, the decision which is worthy of protection and which is not, becomes hegemonic. This discourse has become so pervasive that it now seems obvious that an overhead line with lattice steel pylon leads to the complete loss of the aesthetically high quality of the original landscape. Perhaps even you think so. Even if this landscape was a highly effective and fertilized field. While one form of human intervention is praised, the other is condemned. I will examine the topic because I think that someone could be taking advantage of that concept. We should remember that visual conventions shape what one is used to seeing. When one hears a certain opinion about overhead power lines in the media, in banners, from politicians, from neighbors, one immediately tends to see them as something specific, that resorts to preconceived stereotypes, that praise the rural and fears the technological. And that counts as the reasonable opinion. The danger is that an idea that is actually contingent becomes solidified and determines our laws, our investments, and our dealing with nature and technological objects. The local citizens' initiatives play a double-edged role here. On the one hand, they serve the flow of information in the municipalities, but on the other hand, they ultimately embody a procedure that does not ensure the same freedom for all participants, but rather for the particularly committed or indignant. After all, we should not expect that these citizens can show nothing but their own will. And how do industrial companies and politicians view the issue? Decisions of this magnitude, we are talking about several power lines crossing the whole of Germany, usually do not depend on aesthetic and ecological considerations. But it is strange that the companies prefer the undeniable, more expensive alternative. So, what or whose requirements does the choice of the expensive alternative meet? My thesis: the real estate industry and the energy industry. Regarding the first, Germany is a very densely populated country. It's almost impossible that high structures such as the electricity pylons are not seen by many people. If they are not popular, property values suffer. An often mentioned aspect in the interviews about acceptance of the grid expansion is the fear for personal retirement provision. Even in regions that are structurally weak, there is a high economic interest due to their development as recreational landscapes. I recognize that property interests are in any case neither reprehensible nor illegitimate, but we cannot say that they are equivalent to a genuine interest in the landscape. Regarding to the second point, that brings me to the subject consumption. A real improvement in our ecological trouble is not going to be achieved by the Green New Deal. I mean, switching from coal-fired power to green electricity, but by consuming less, by changing our behavior. The conviction that technological means are sufficient to fight the climate crisis is a fallacy. And moreover, it provides us with an alibi for not thinking about the current standard of living. I think underground wiring would not make this situation more serious. Something that has not passed through our eyes before, it's not present in our minds. And this time, the reason is that something was deliberately removed from our field of perception, and at a very high cost. Hiding the grid underground does not exactly push us in the direction of ecological awareness. The underground wiring continues to tune us into living as we do now, with a clear conscience.
Nor should we forget that consumerism is a product of overproduction. This means that the decision for its reduction is not only a matter for consumers, but also for politicians who should be alert about the actions of corporations. In view of this, the underground cabling is becoming a bit more critical because operating without being observed minimizes the promotion of a community-oriented behavior of the corporations, which in other cases is present, at least for the concern for their good reputation.
Let's talk about the technological object. Objects are not malicious or benevolent. Nevertheless, the active character that we often give to things is important. That things seem friendly, enigmatic, repulsive, banal, or whatever to us is due to an act of transference. We project our own feelings onto things.
Instead of burying them, let's take the chance for reflection and think about why a large part of the population does not like the pilots. An answer could be that we get an image of us as machine-like egoistic beings that always strives to maximize its usefulness. Technology is often seen as violence over nature and also violence over ourselves because it's associated with many of the evils of our society, such as the loss of integration into natural life rhythms, or the loneliness of the modern man, or the lack of organic community ties, unhealthy diet, and so on.
This perception has its beginnings in the early modern period. Our recognition as part of nature broke down due to the emergence of the binary structure form of cognition. Through the predominance of our reason over our natural being, sensuousness and affectivity have seen themselves restricted. Nature has remained sustained for us only as something that can be perceived from a certain distance.
For several decades now, we have been experiencing an attempt to rewind this path. But how exactly? The author of the first draft of the Federal Nature Conservation Act in the 70s saw the pre-industrial rural cultural landscape as ideal and the urban culture as destructive. There is a belief that true human recreation means our self-discovery, and that without this chance of internalization and purification through nature, we could not gain the mental resistance to the demands of life's struggle.
Today's supporters of underground cabling, at least those who are not only motivated by economical aspects, seem to me to share this idyllic view. Man should guide a conversion to the old natural values and ways of life. But on which understanding of nature is this hope in a healing power based on? The perfect nature is one of the oldest ideas of mankind, either because it was created by a perfect God or because it is perfect in itself. Nature would be wild, innocent. Such idealization leads to the view that nature would be spoiled by contact with human beings. And that would not be an encouraging sign for our undertaking to bring us closer. Such statements correspond to the so-called bourgeois aesthetic of nature, which is an expression of a person who is unable to recognize nature in himself and therefore seeks it outside as an utopian counter-image to his own social existence. This means that it perpetuates the idea that the human is a stranger, not part of nature, and on the other hand, that he doesn't seek a real encounter with something natural. Non-human nature gives us the incomparable opportunity to exercise our understanding that the other is valid for its own sake. There is no encounter with the otherness, with the diversity, when we tell the landscape how we want it to look to please us. Or do we give our beloved ones a script where it says what they should say when we meet up for a coffee? Talking about nature as a living subject in its own right corresponds to an understanding of nature as something that appeals to us, that sees us and puts us in a certain mood. It makes something with us and not only what we have decided.
In short, it is not a question here of trying to leave the landscape virgin so that it's shown to us as it is. We are part of nature, and what we do, as long as it's kept within respectful limits, it's within nature. Nor I am questioning the bearing of cables because I think it's necessary to see everything. Every perception always contains a non-perception, and the sixth person must necessarily abstract things from some elements in order to recognize them. Nor I am questioning that we are trying to have a pleasant environment. I, myself, also like to work on non-spontaneous gardens, like Klein Glienicke in South Berlin, and I like to sit on its benches under magnolias. English landscape gardens emerged as a contrast to the geometrically planned and decorated French gardens. The English gardens are characterized by avoiding being seen as a complete subjugation of nature to human principles of form, but they are actually completely artificial. What I am questioning is the act of hiding and the following pretentious claim that in this way a real and beneficial contact with nature is being stimulated. And this kind of posturing has gone so far that it is present not only in the social movements, but also in the laws that advocate the placebo of underground wiring.
So far, I have been addressing the critical points. What is the discussion about, the possible hidden motivations, the denunciation that bearing cables does not contribute to our ecological awareness. We have spoken about the negative impression that the pylons have caused up to now, about how, since the early modern period, a determined way of interpreting reality has been anchored, and about our bourgeois vision of nature. I propose now to concentrate on a possible twist. We have said that objects inspire impressions on us. Perhaps, instead of changing them, we could work on ourselves. Our thinking is accustomed to applying the essence of things being too sparse. But man could think that one dwells on things, and so a human gesture may be seen in them. They can be seen as more than a simple montage of matter. One can even compare technology with language. Both can be understood as a medium that enables us to do something, but also as something that constitutes us as human beings. Without technology, man would not exist and would never have existed. Technology is not to be understood as accessory to man, but it is through technology that we become human. This does not mean that technology is what serves us to satisfy our needs. Man's being consists precisely in the task of conceiving ourselves, and the technical object is the product of that effort.
So, what is the human element in the transmission towers? They could, instead of contempt, create other impressions. For instance, their respect for the work necessary for its installation. In this sense, they would be a condensation of productive gestures. The imprint of the invention of the building, of the understanding the electricity phenomenon and the behavior of the material. The simplicity that manifests itself in the object, in the sense that such a tower cut in simple lines rejects the overload of luxury or jewelry. The capacity of human planning, which organizes the population by favoring the emergence of new residential nuclei or the unification of existing ones, and the gratitude for the collection of knowledge, as these towers collect the experiences from different centuries.
We often speak of alienation when referring to our distance to technical objects, and we often think this alienation is caused by them. They alienate us. We could now try to consider if it is rather because of our ignorance. Perception is not enough to dissolve our distance to them. An object must be thought and understood. A technical education is needed so that the beauty and essence of the technical objects can become apparent. We need help to educate ourselves, and engineers, as witnesses and agents of the relation between human society and the world of technical objects, could help. Through them, the integration of the technical object into the culture could be possible.
Unfortunately, it is claimed that such kinds of entanglements with social implications are not part of the professional competence of engineers. The real basic task of the engineer, to make use of the technology to contribute to solving the needs of society, is not fully understood. Many say that the role of the engineer is limited to making the skills of their profession available to others. From my personal experience in grid development projects since 2018, I see that engineers often keep their opinions on ongoing projects to themselves under the pretext that the significant decisions in these projects are of political nature anyway. Although this last statement may be essentially correct, we should not forget that engineers, compared to politicians, have a broader understanding on the uncertainties associated with technology, and that in a democratic state it is possible to intervene, and it's not about blindly obeying governmental decisions. Therefore, in order to fulfill their social duty, engineers should not interfere with the decisions, but illuminate them. They should become active when there is an opportunity to make recommendations and reach the population, especially when the decisions are made in part through public consultations, as in our analyzed case. The goal of public acceptance that we have spoken of, short underground cables, simplifies the implementation of grid expansion without having so many affairs with the public, should not be a task of engineers. That the engineers know the maneuvers or the political intention does not mean they have to be part of it. However, that is the current state, mainly due to their disinterested attitude or their conviction that the discussion is not their concern.